Polis, after we get this big chart generated, Polis makes the claim that he thinks that rhetoricians are the most powerful people in a city. And, there's some truth to that, at least on the appearance. I mean, who runs everything? I'm thinking of the clouds, I'm sorry. There's this section in Aristophanes' Clouds where we go through this whole thing about who runs things, and the answer is always the buggard. Well, the answer, though, it could also be the rhetoricians. They run everything. Who are all the public advocates? Well, they're rhetoricians. Who are all the statesmen? They're rhetoricians, too. Who are the leaders of all the industries? Well, they're rhetoricians. They're all smoothies, right? They seem to be the most powerful people of all, and Polis is very close to the appearances when he says these are the most powerful people. And how does their power manifest itself? Well, they can kill their enemies or have them exiled. They can expropriate their property. How? By persuading people through the art of public speaking that these are the right things to do. So, can't be any more powerful than that. Rhetoricians are tyrants. And Socrates makes an extraordinary claim. He says he doesn't think that these people are powerful at all. In fact, he thinks these are the weakest of men. Now that sounds really wild, but in order to understand what he's saying, we have to recognize that he's redefining, in a sense, power and freedom. And remember, when Gorgias says that rhetoric produces the greatest good, he describes the greatest good as freedom in one city and power over others. Freedom and power mean the same thing in this context. To be free is to be able to do something. It's to have a certain potency, a certain ability. We're talking about what they call positive freedom here, as opposed to just not being interfered with. It doesn't mean freedom as such, but freedom to do things as opposed to freedom from other people doing things to you or being just left alone. What we call negative liberty generally just means being left alone. But you can be left alone and not be able to do anything, and be powerless. What they mean by freedom here is power, the ability to do things, and that's what's known as positive liberty or positive freedom. Socrates doesn't think that the rhetoricians, that the tyrants, the politicians, have any real power, positive freedom or power. Because although they have the capacity to do whatever they want to do, or see fit to do, whatever they choose to do, what freedom is actually doing what you really want. Can we all agree that to be free is to do what you really want? It's not too hard a definition to swallow. Well, Socrates then says, well, what do we really want to do? And his answer is, we all want to do the good. We all want to do what's good for us. However, being able to do whatever you see fit is not necessarily the same as being able to do what's really good for you. Why? Because being able to do whatever you see fit means that you have the capacity to choose things that aren't good for you. And his argument is that the people who unjustly kill or exile or expropriate aren't really doing what they want to do.
Well, I thought it was more than just that. I thought it was like the slavery of passion.
That comes in later, but right now in the conversation with Polis, really the issue is simply this. Do the people who have power in the conventional sense have real power? Because what real power is doing what you want, what you really genuinely wish for. And what all of us really genuinely wish for is what's good for us. However, to do unjust things might be what you think you want to do, but it's not what you really want to do, because to do injustice is not good for you. To do injustice, he argues, introduces corruption and baseness and sickness into one's own soul. Therefore, the people who have the capacity, the quote-unquote freedom and quote-unquote power to do injustice, really are very, very weak. Because what they have is they have a capacity to do things they don't really want to do, namely to damage themselves. No one really wants to damage himself. No one really wants to be worse off. And the only reason why people choose to do things that damage them is that they're ignorant, deluded, confused about what really benefits them. Now this is in a way it sounds so simple and it's almost definitional. He's monkeying around with words, it seems. But what he's really doing is something far more substantive. He's trying to give us insight into what human choice really means, what human freedom and human power is really about. These choices that we make are always for something. He says, what do we wish for? Well, we wish for things that are intrinsically good. We don't wish for piles of stones or wads of money or things like that because these are intrinsically good. Great big heaps of paper, Uncle Scrooge's money bin, is totally worthless or useless unless you can spend it on something else. And this is why a miser is such a pervert, because they mistake something that's merely instrumentally good for something that's good in and of itself. The point is that there are things that we pursue as ends in themselves, and things that we simply pursue as means to those ends. Socrates says what we truly wish for is the ultimate goal of all of our actions, what all of our actions are tending towards. And if you ask yourself what you're always choosing from any range of options you have available, is you're choosing the better option. What's better for you. And what that means is that we're all pursuing what's good for us. There's a very egoistic teaching here. Socrates believes that all human beings are really out to benefit themselves, and that that's the primary motivation of human action. He also identifies in this conversation with Polus this end, the good that we're choosing, with happiness, with our own well-being, self-actualization. And then one has to raise the question now, well, if all human beings in every day and every way are striving for happiness, for well-being, how is it that so many of us suffer so much? That explains human suffering if we're all striving for happiness. We're mistaken about where our happiness really lies. There's a truth about what makes us happy, and there are many falsehoods. And the reason why human beings suffer, even though they strive so ardently throughout their entire lives to attain happiness, is that they can be mistaken. And that if one's mistaken about happiness, no matter how much quote-unquote freedom and power one really has, one isn't free to do what one really wants to do. And one isn't powerful enough to do what one really wants to do. Are there any questions about this point? I mean, is it basically clear? Well, when you get to the end of the text, you start talking about the afterworld and punishment of the wicked and rewards for the good. Socrates recognizes that you have to have some kind of cosmic scheme at work in order to apportion the rewards out to those who deserve them, because God knows human beings have not managed to do this on our own. So there is a kind of cosmic justice that he appeals to. Cycles of reincarnation and all this. You can't escape by dying. You carry all your sins with you into the next life. The main reason for that is this, that everything is registered on your own soul, ultimately. All of your actions make who you are. They create our character. We make ourselves who we are by the things that we do, and by doing unjust things, we make ourselves unjust people. Conversely, if somebody does something just to us, they make us more just. And this is why Socrates says that if you are a bad person, your soul is sick, what you need is just punishment. Because to be punished justly is to become more just oneself. When he talks about things like killing people, expropriating their property, and driving in exile, it's very clear that he thinks that there are circumstances under which this is appropriate. And he does think that there are some people who are so sick that, in effect, the only thing to do for them is to euthanize them, that they're better off dead. So he does seem to believe in the death penalty. Frankly, the kinds of deaths that Athenians meted out to one another were rather humane compared to the practices of the world at the time, or even the world today. Dying of hemlock was a terribly awful way of dying, apparently. But the point is that he really believed that the whole range of punishment, from ostracism to exile to death, would be appropriate if meted out properly. I clearly think that if he sat down to actually come up with political proposals, he certainly wouldn't have gone for the Athenian democratic system, right, where 500 people at random, or not necessarily at random, sometimes they had professional jurors or pensioners would sit in judgment of cases. And they had all the problems with juries that we have with politicians. Professional politicians, oh God. Professional juries, even worse. Of course, randomly selected juries are not that great too, but at least you don't have a whole class of people who get sort of cynical about the whole process. In fact, I think that our politics would be improved if we simply had random election of people. There would be no more talk about term limits because it would be virtually impossible for someone to get chosen randomly twice. A lottery. His argument is this: if somebody does justice to you, it makes you more just. Yeah, and that means punishing you with justice, or, if you will, encouraging you or rewarding you justly. It can improve your soul. But he does argue that no matter what somebody does to you, they can't make you more unjust. How is that? Well, his basic argument is that you have to cooperate in some way with your own corruption, and that nobody can make you a bad person by doing bad things to you, although he seems to think that somebody can make you a good person by doing good things to you, which seems a little odd. It makes me think about, the joke about how many psychotherapists does it take to change a light bulb. One, but the bulb really has to want to change, right? And the idea is, I guess, that the criminal really has to want to be improved, or the punishment won't improve them. I think criminal behavior has a lot to do with a kind of unchanneled willfulness, a sort of striving for autonomy. Punishment itself, though, isn't going to do that necessarily, so much as forcing a person to try and recognize where their good lies. That might have to constrain them, but actually, applying the hot pinchers or whatever, they were doing, that in itself, I think, would tend to actually make the person refuse to listen to you out of a very natural sort of self-assertiveness. I do think a lot of evil behavior, a lot of bad behavior is a product of human self-assertiveness. There's an attempt to try and mark off your identity from others. There's this wonderful book. It's an okay book, actually. It's wonderful as a collection of anecdotes called Boys Will Be Men. It's written by the headmaster of a boys' school. He obviously loves boys, and in a platonic sense, and loves educating them and improving them, and has all these wonderful anecdotes, and he has a discussion of evil boys. And one of the things that sort of came out of that was something that I've always sort of known, I guess, which is that a lot of times people do bad things as a way of trying to assert their identity, or individuate themselves.
You're saying
and unchanneled energy for self-actualization will often lead a person to identify the moral order of things as something oppressive that they want to push away, because it's usually the parental order at the same time. And what one needs to do is one needs to somehow detach those strivings for self-actualization and individuation from this rebel stance against the good, and try and get people to recognize that what they should be allowing this energy, this libido, this eros in them to carry them towards is precisely their own good. And that's sometimes punishment doesn't really do that. Sometimes it works, and other times it doesn't. But the thing is, it's got to be carefully calibrated. But the goal is to try and open a person's eyes to see where their good lies. And oftentimes, I think what happens is because people do this badly, it just sort of confirms people in this kind of rebelliousness. And how do you really, calibrate these things? It has to be an extraordinarily difficult thing. Again, we just have to give up the idea that looking to our own penal system will give us any guidance. 3 strikes and you're out, minimum sentencing guidelines, all this kind of stuff. As down as I am on criminals, these sort of cookie-cutter, one-size-fits-all kinds of things are obviously not designed to make people better. Given that we have such a complete collapse of legislation in this sense in our society for the law-abiding, it seems unreasonable to expect that we can take people who are criminals and make them better. And maybe the best we can do in this society is do the other forms of punishment, right? Restitution. Somebody tortures your dog, you make them buy you another dog. Or somebody beats you with a hammer, you make them pay your medical bills. I mean, there are laws now to do restitution. A friend of mine was clubbed over in the back of the head with a hammer a few months ago. And he was in Oregon, and they had to pay, his medical bills.
Well, hammerhead.
No, it was a bad situation. Retribution. I don't think vengeance is an improper, motive. It's very satisfying to see retribution for evil acts, and deterrence. I think a lot of bad debates are conducted on punishment because people think you need to have one justification: retribution, restitution, deterrence. Why not have them all? Try and pursue all these goals at once. The one goal that I don't think that our system pursues, except by accident, is rehabilitation. The notion of a penitentiary, you know who invented the penitentiary? The Quakers. And they were invented to make people penitent, to isolate them, and encourage moral regeneration. And that wouldn't be a bad thing, but penitentiaries today are just schools for crime. We don't have a notion of statecraft as soulcraft, for one reason. That would get us into all kinds of controversies about what the good is. We can't do that. We can't even do that even if our own self-preservation were at stake. Even to talk about minimal virtues necessary to make our present system work is too controversial to really, teach these sorts of things. That's a problem that we face. It has to do with the loss of whatever moral cohesiveness our culture once had. And it did have much more moral cohesiveness at one time. Now, when you talk about moral cohesiveness, that's always presupposes that there are insiders and outsiders in a society, right? And we can't have any outsiders anymore. And because we can't have any outsiders, we can't have any insides either. And that's the problem with pluralism. Pluralism replaces the kind of moral cohesion necessary to maintain social order with just the endless multiplication of different perspectives on things. And that's not necessarily, a long-term survival plan for any kind of society. But we can't bear the idea of having anybody be an outsider. But you can't have boundaries and standards without having people who fall on one side or the other. And you can't have a culture without some people feeling alienated from it. So this is the difficulty that America faces today. And there are two other arguments I want to deal with, and only one is really important. So I'll just deal with it. Socrates makes another stunning claim. Not only does he argue that the people who seem to have power and freedom really don't, because they often don't use it to pursue what they really want, namely their own happiness, their own good. He also makes the claim that to do injustice is worse than to suffer injustice. Okay, and this sounds all very namby-pamby to people today. And Polus is absolutely scathing in his response to this. He just thinks this is the most mealy-mouthed twaddle that he's ever heard. And he's very sarcastic in dealing with poor Socrates, but Socrates keeps plugging away at him, and he beats him down. And the argument is very simple. To do injustice to somebody else is to harm them, maybe even kill them. But it is also to corrupt oneself. Because to do unjust things is to make you an unjust person. And what is injustice? It's a vice. And what is vice? It's a sickness of the soul. And so by doing vicious things, we become vicious, sick, unhappy people. Now, the person who has injustice done to him, however, no matter how badly harmed the person might be physically, they might be killed. But to have injustice done to you does not necessarily make you an unjust person unless you somehow cooperate. The power of resistance for Socrates is always there. You can only be corrupted by conspiring with your corruptors. And therefore a person cannot make you into a bad person without you approving of it and helping out. They can make you sick in the sense they can make you physically ill. They can make you physically dead. But for Socrates, the place where happiness most properly resides is the soul. And a person can be killed, but by killing somebody, you don't make them into a monster. And for Socrates, living is not unconditionally good. Only living a virtuous or good life is good. And so, given the choice between merely living as a bad person and dying, living a shorter life as a decent person, for Socrates, there's no real difficulty with that. He would choose to lead a shorter, more decent life than a longer, indecent life. You can be made to suffer. Injustice hurts. That's a bad thing. But it's not as bad for the victim as it is for the perpetrator, because it cuts the perpetrator to the core, to the quick. It gets their soul. It gets in there and rots their soul, where it can only make the victim physically miserable. But it can't make them spiritually sick unless they give in and cooperate with their own destruction. And that all too frequently happens. People under extreme duress will come to cooperate with the people who victimize them. People who work evil in this world are masters at gaining the cooperation of their victims and then completely destroying them. There's no question about that. But Socrates doesn't believe that that can happen without the cooperation of the person. And therefore there's a kind of invulnerability of virtue or happiness to injustice. And they can kill you, but they can't make you to a bad person. That's the argument. And therefore, he says, given the choice between doing injustice and suffering it, he would always prefer to suffer it. Because to suffer it doesn't make him a bad person, whereas to do it does. Now, of course, he would prefer not to have to choose between one or the other at all. And he makes very clear about that. I'd rather neither suffer nor do injustice. But if I'm forced to choose, I would rather choose to suffer than to do. And again, it just all leads back to his whole account of the nature of happiness, which is really identical to virtue and resides ultimately in the well-ordered soul, which is invulnerable, he thinks, to external duress. Now you might wonder what he would say, about people who were imprisoned in psychiatric hospitals in the Soviet Union and things like that. Isn't it possible to really be driven out of your mind? The trouble with children, though, is that their characters are so unformed to begin with. I mean, what Socrates is really dealing with is the idea of, what if you take a person who's basically decent, and that means he's presupposing they've grown up, that they've pretty much attained a certain age of majority of self-control, that they have a well-formed character. That can't be destroyed. But then you have to raise the question, well, what about somebody who hasn't quite gotten there yet, who isn't so well-formed? Well, those people are far more vulnerable. This is why Aristotle in his Ethics has this category of the bestial, which is below vice. And he argues that there are certain people who really are beasts, in the sense that they've never really become moral personalities. They've never really developed the capacity to be responsible or to have characters, good or bad. How does he say this? Well, he says, it's very clear that he believes that it has everything to do with upbringing. He thinks cannibals are bestial people, or kinds of people who prey on others, the travelers, roving con artists. These people are trained from day one to regard people outside their group as just natural resources, prey. Now, of course, this is true about most small groups of people, right? Most primitive little groups, and it was pretty true of the Greek city-states, too, for that matter. But what he's pointing to is the fact that, bad laws bestialize. The Greeks were willing to massacre one another and sell one another into slavery. And one of the great political reforms that's genuinely proposed in the Republic is for the Greeks to start treating fellow Greeks like they treat members of their own city, and to start treating the barbarians better by treating them as well as their fellow Greeks. He's trying to propose widening the circle of civilized behavior a bit. Anybody who's brought up to regard groups of people as just prey, they have been in some way bestialized. They've not developed, for instance, the capacity to empathize with other people. And that's really, really part of what bestiality, I think, boils down to. Lack of moral sensibility. Lack of ability to be moved by suffering and so forth. Aristotle is very clear that, if you will, sensitivity is at the core of practical reason. That being finely attuned to the condition of other people is part of what it is to have a well-developed moral sensibility. He doesn't bring this out as much as other writers, but it's very clearly there. And when you talk about people who are bestial or sociopathic, psychopathic would be the terminology we use, part of that is just the lack of any kind of empathy, the inability to feel the pain of others. Again, children become problematic here. Children can be easily destroyed by injustice. They can not only be made unjust, they can be made something even, if you will, subjust. They can be brutalized in a very literal sense. And this is why, again, legislation is so important. Because at the center of Greek politics is a concern with education, cultivation, paideia. And there's a passage here which I think is one of the strongest knowledge claims you ever find in Plato. And it's worth ending our session with today. Page 55 at the bottom. Above where it says 470e, a couple lines. They're talking about Archelaus, who seized the throne of Macedonia through a number of crimes in unjust acts, and Socrates is being asked by Polus, isn't he a happy guy? He's gotten away with all these crimes. He's become king, page 55. Through crime, he's unjust and unpunished, unrepentant, and isn't he the happiest of all? And Socrates says, just above 470, he says, I don't know, Polus, for I've not yet been with the man. He has to be near. You can't just look at a person's station in life and say, oh, they're happy. You have to get near. Why? Because you have to be able to see more into their soul rather than just the persona that they have or the status that they have in society. What? You would know if you were with him, but otherwise on the spot you do not know that he is happy? By Zeus, indeed, I do not. It's clear then, Socrates, that you will say you don't even know that the great king is happy either. And he was, of course, the Persian emperor, the most powerful man in the world, maybe the most powerful man in all of human history up to that time. He certainly had the greatest freedom and power. And Socrates says, at the top of 56, and what I'll say is true. I don't know if he's happy, just by knowing he's the great king. For I do not know how he stands in regard to education and justice. What? Is the whole of happiness in this? As I say, at any rate, Polus. For I assert that the noble and good man and woman are happy, the unjust and base wretched. So the whole of it has to do with education and justice. And justice here, I think we have to understand in this broad sense of righteousness, right? Again, the Greek word that's translated as justice, dike, can be translated as right. Okay, what's the just or the right? And justice can also be translated or rendered as righteousness. And Aristotle makes very clear that this is a crucial distinction because righteousness refers to comprehensive well-being, comprehensive virtue, whereas the narrow sense of justice refers to particularly how one deals with others, right, which is a narrower issue. You have to be righteous, you have to be just, but there's more to righteousness than just justice. And so I think that what Socrates is saying here is, I do not know how he stands in regard to education and righteousness. And it's very clear that you don't become a righteous individual without the proper education. Because at the basis of moral character are good habits, which are inculcated from an early age. It doesn't mean that morality is simply a matter of good habits, but that's the foundation for it. And everything else, reflectiveness, prudence, more refined sensibilities, have to be built on top of those. If you don't have that foundation of good habits, you might be well-meaning. Socrates says, though, that's true of all of us. We're all well-meaning. No matter how deluded we might be, we're all well-meaning. But if you don't have that kind of stability of the soul that's parted by good habits, that kind of orderliness and self-control, then your good intentions frequently come to nothing. I have to say that I'm as much a product of chaotic, bad education as anybody I know. I have some of the worst habits of anybody I know. And I have to recognize and repent of this. I don't repent it, I rue it, that it really has prevented me from doing a lot of things that I otherwise feel I would have been able to do if I had had better habits. But I had very permissive parents. And I resent them for it. I really do. I deeply resent them. Do whatever you feel like when you feel like it. And believe me, I am quite adept at doing whatever I feel like it. Whenever I feel like it. That's about the only thing I'm quite adept at. They don't want to impose upon my autonomy the invulnerability of good character to injustice, the invulnerability of happiness to injustice. Socrates talks about it really only makes sense if you've got a person with a well-formed character to begin with. And you've got kids, they can be done far more damage, and they can be made unjust by being treated unjustly. Locke talks about it, 1 in a million, somebody who just seems to pop right out into the world with a fully formed character, and is just sort of astonishingly excellent from the very beginning. Whereas, he says, most virtue that people have, the virtues of most people, are owed entirely to the cultivation process, the education process they have. Those sorts of people can be terribly, terribly messed up by being badly educated. And so this is at the core of the meaning of the idea that legislation produces the health of the soul. When you understand just what an educational regime the Greek city-state was, properly understood. Education is entirely the core of it. And it's a kind of lifetime process, too. It certainly included things like military service. The idea was that by taking part in the common practices of the society, at every age one becomes better or becomes perfected as a human being of that particular age and station in life. So there are excellences for the old and excellences for the middle age and excellences for the young, and they tried to take that into account. The Greeks, however, tended to be really, if you want to, you can complain today about the youth obsession of our culture, but the Greeks were probably the most youth-obsessed culture in history. They had the most incredibly pessimistic and negative attitude towards aging. They thought it was just a long, drawn-out, slow death. And this is why they so eroticized adolescence. Because they thought of aging as something that didn't have much value at all. But still, even with that, they had certain roles that older people would play. And one of the things that's interesting in Plato's proposals in the Republic or the Laws is the dignity that is ascribed to the roles of the elders in a society. Because youth is a time of folly, and Plato was a philosopher, and he saw that although there's a very large number of old fools, still, if you're pursuing wisdom, you get more of it as you grow older, and the wisest people who pursue it will be the older ones, on average. And so there's a greater dignity of age in his political proposals than in most Greek city-states. Personally, I welcome every year. I don't feel that my life really came together at all until I was 30. But I know people that, God, high school, those were the days. I was miserable as a child, less miserable as an adolescent. My 20s, I was slowly getting better, but when I hit 30, I thought, my God, I'm starting to live, finally. So I just keep looking forward to that next big round number. Next time, let's just go forward and looking at, we'll begin to see Callicles. Callicles is marvelous, because if you want to defend injustice and power politics against justice, it's the kind of speech that Callicles makes that you need to make. But Socrates still defeats him. So we'll look at Callicles next time. He's a remarkable character, whether he lived or not. He's quite remarkable.